The Old West was full of noise gunshots, stampedes, the howl of a blizzard through a canyon, but the most dangerous sound was silence. The kind of silence that smothered a woman's quiet agony, that dismissed a child's frantic hands, that erased a man's truth because his skin was the wrong color. Tonight, 3 souls tried to speak into that vast, unforgiving quiet, and the whole town plugged its ears. But one person leaned in. One person chose to believe what nobody else would. A doctor, a telegraph operator, a young attorney. Each of them heard a whisper that could have been lost forever, and because they did, everything changed. These are the true stories of the West's hidden cries and the lone believers who answered them. Lila Mae Harper had learned to arrange her hair so the bruises wouldn't show. A careful art of combs and braids that kept the purple smudges along her temple hidden beneath a sweep of chestnut waves. But she couldn't hide the way she flinched when the church bell rang, or the way she sat down on the Har mercantile bench as though the wood was lined with shards of glass. Silverton, Colorado, was a silver camp that pretended to be a town. Its main street, a river of frozen mud 9 months out of the year. Its citizens so focused on extracting ore from the mountain that they'd long ago decided not to notice what Edmund Harper did to his wife behind the faded curtains of their pine-board house. Edmund was the foreman of the Smuggler Union Mine, a man whose paycheck funded the saloon's whiskey supply, and whose fists, the town tacitly agreed, were a private matter between a husband and his household. Lila Mae had tried to whisper her truth once to the pastor's wife, a rigid woman named Beatrice Wembley, who had stared at the younger woman's careful description of accidents and clumsiness with eyes that hardened like cooling tallow before saying, "Scripture calls a wife to submit, dear. Perhaps you might try harder to keep a peaceful home." That was the day Lila Mae stopped talking and started folding inward like a frost-bitten blossom, her only remaining outward sign of distress being the unconscious phrase she murmured every time she settled into a chair, a tiny breathy whisper that she didn't even know she was uttering, 5 words that seemed to escape her lips from some deep, bruised place. "It hurts when I sit." The person who finally heard those words was not a pastor, not a lawman, not even a woman friend, but a worn-out physician named Dr. Elias Boone, who had come to Silverton to escape his own ghosts in the typhoid wards of Chicago, and who ran his practice out of a drafty cabin at the edge of the creek, seeing patients who paid in chickens, cordwood, and occasionally actual coin. Lila Mae appeared at his door one Tuesday morning with a sprained wrist that Edmund had allowed her to seek treatment for because a wife who couldn't pour his coffee was worthless to him, and Elias, whose hands had lost none of their gentleness despite the horrors he'd seen, noticed immediately that the swelling on her forearm wasn't the kind of injury you got from a tumble down the porch steps. He wrapped the wrist in a cool linen bandage, his silence a deliberate invitation. And when Lila Mae finally lowered herself into the patient chair and that involuntary whisper slipped out, "It hurts when I sit," Elias didn't pretend he hadn't heard. He pulled his stool close, not looming, not pressing, and said in a voice as soft as the first snow, "Then let's talk about where it hurts, Mrs. Harper, and how long it's been hurting." What followed was a slow, halting confession that took 3 more visits, each one disguised as treatment for a new accident, during which Elias documented every contusion, every old fracture that had healed crooked, every flinch when he moved his stethoscope near her ribs. He knew the legal landscape he was stepping into. Colorado had laws on the books against wife-beating, but a jury of minors would laugh a charge out of court if the accuser was a woman with no money and no male protector. And Elias had no illusions about his own precarious position as an outsider with a mild reputation for drinking. And yet, on the 4th visit, when Lila Mae arrived with a cut above her eye that required 3 stitches and could not speak at all, only trembling like an aspen leaf in a high wind, Elias Boone made a decision that recast his entire existence. He closed his practice for the day, saddled his one swaybacked horse, and rode 20 miles to the county seat to swear out a complaint before Judge Harlan Trout, a man whose reputation for irascibility was matched only by his hatred of bullies. Elias presented his medical notes, his meticulous drawings of the injuries, and a sworn statement from a teenage stable boy who had once witnessed Edmund throw a full whiskey bottle at his wife through an open window. And then, with the judge's warrant in his pocket, Elias rode back to Silverton with the town marshal, a reluctant, tobacco-chewing man named Gus Fenton, who would have preferred to look the other way, but couldn't ignore a direct court order. The arrest of Edmund Harper on the steps of the saloon, his suspenders dangling, his face a knot of disbelief and rage, sent a shockwave through Silverton that felt like a physical earthquake. Men who had drunk with Edmund, worked beside him, laughed at his crude jokes, suddenly had to confront the fact that a quiet doctor had seen what they'd all chosen not to see. The trial lasted 2 days, a cramped affair in the drafty town hall, and Lila May's testimony, delivered in a voice that cracked but never broke, was the first time many of those miners had ever heard a woman describe, in plain words, what it felt like to be thrown against a stove, to be kicked in the ribs with steel-toed boots, to lie awake at night praying her husband would pass out drunk before he remembered she existed. The jury convicted Edmund Harper of assault. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in the state penitentiary, and the town of Silverton, forced to look at what it had condoned, underwent a quiet transformation. Beatrice Wembley began organizing a women's support circle that met in the church basement. The marshal started actually responding to domestic disturbance calls, and Elias Boone, the doctor who had heard a whisper and refused to let it die, found his waiting room suddenly full of patients who paid in respect as much as currency. Lila May Harper left Silverton the following spring, traveling by stage to a cousin's farm in Oregon. But before she went, she stopped at Elias's cabin and pressed a small embroidered handkerchief into his hand, a piece of fabric she'd stitched during the long months of recovery. Its corner worked with a single word in blue thread: believer. Elias kept that handkerchief in his pocket for the rest of his days, pulling it out whenever a new patient walked through his door with a story the world wanted to ignore, a tangible reminder that the most powerful medicine in the West wasn't laudanum or a surgeon saw, but the simple, radical act of leaning in and saying, "I hear you, and I'm not looking away." Caleb Thorne was born during a blizzard so fierce the midwife said his mother's screams were swallowed by the wind. And perhaps that was a sign, because the boy never heard another sound in his life. Not the bawl of a calf, not the crack of a bullwhip, not the whispered bedtime stories his mother tried to press into his small hands, before the diphtheria took her when he was 4. By the time Caleb was 10 years old, living on his uncle's hardscrabble homestead outside the new settlement of North Platte, Nebraska, he had developed a fluent private language of his own hands, a rich vocabulary of signs that could describe the difference between a prairie falcon and a red-tailed hawk, the precise way a colt wobbles to its feet, the exact pressure of the silence that closed around him every night like a fist. Uncle Orson Thorne was a deacon in the local church, a barrel-bellied man whose public prayers were loud and whose private cruelties were quiet. And he had long decided that Caleb's deafness was a mark of divine disfavor, a curse to be beaten out of the boy's flesh with a razor strop in the darkness of the barn where no one could hear the blows land. Caleb had no way to tell anyone what was happening. The townsfolk of North Platte saw his frantic hand movements as a kind of feeble-mindedness, a tragic affliction to be pitied with headshakes and awkwardly averted eyes. And when the boy once tried to mime the violence to the general store clerk by pointing at the lash marks on his back and signing "Uncle Strap Barn," the clerk merely frowned and handed him a peppermint stick, assuming the child was making heathen gestures. The only person in the entire settlement who watched those hands with something other than pity was a 43-year-old spinster named Ada Monroe, the telegraph operator for the Union Pacific Station a woman who had spent her youth deciphering the tap-tap of Morse code until the dots and dashes became a second heartbeat in her bones, and who recognized in the rhythmic dance of Caleb's fingers a language that was simply waiting for a dictionary. Ada had no formal training in sign, no manual, no precedent, but she began to watch Caleb through the station window every time he walked past on his way to haul water, cataloging the repeated gestures, the way he touched his chest and then mimed a strap cracking downward, the way he pointed to his ear and then shook his head with a desperate, imploring look that had nothing to do with mental deficiency and everything to do with a soul trapped behind a wall of silence. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal night that left Caleb limping and bleeding through the back of his shirt, the boy stumbled into the telegraph office not for medicine. He had long given up on that, but for the sheer warmth of the stove, and Ada, acting on an impulse that would reroute the entire course of her quiet life, took his hands in hers and gently, deliberately, began to shape them. She didn't speak because she'd already learned that speaking was useless. Instead, she used her own fingers to trace the dots and dashes of Morse code against his palm, a simple pattern that meant ICE, and something in Caleb's dark, exhausted eyes ignited like a struck match. Over the next 6 months, Ada and Caleb built a pidgin language together, part home sign, part fingerspelled Morse, part the natural mimicry that arises between two human beings who are determined to connect. And the shack behind the telegraph station became a schoolroom where the click of the key and the flutter of hands wove the first sentences the boy had ever been able to share. He told her about the barn. He told her about the strop. He told her about the prayers his uncle made him recite aloud, not caring that the words came out garbled and twisted, only caring that the boy's humiliation was complete. Ada, whose entire professional life had been dedicated to transmitting messages that others composed, now found herself composing the most dangerous message of her life, a formal, detailed complaint to the county sheriff, typed out on the station's letterhead, its paragraphs laying bare the systematic abuse of a child by one of the town's most respected citizens. The sheriff, a man named Rourke, who had been elected on a platform of keeping the peace, which in practice meant keeping everybody's dirty laundry firmly in the basket, showed up at Ada's office with a patronizing smile and told her that a deaf boy's imagination was no basis for accusing a church deacon. Ada didn't argue. She simply invited Rourke to return the following morning, and when he did, she had Caleb seated at the telegraph desk, his small hands poised over the key. For the next 20 minutes, Caleb transmitted his testimony in flawless Morse code, a stream of dots and dashes that Ada translated aloud into a narrative so specific, so horrifying, so undeniably true that Sheriff Rourke's face went from skeptical to gray. The boy described the pattern of the strap's buckle, the smell of the hay in the barn, the way Uncle Orson always hummed the same hymn while he swung, and Rourke, who had heard plenty of lies in his career, recognized the unshakable ring of truth. The arrest of Deacon Orson Thorne during Sunday services, the cuffs clinking over his pressed white shirt, was a scandal that rocked North Platte to its foundations, and the trial that followed, with Ada serving as Caleb's sworn interpreter, established one of the first legal precedents in Nebraska for accepting alternative communication as valid court testimony. Orson was convicted of aggravated child abuse and sentenced to 10 years, and Ada Monroe, the spinster telegraph operator who had once been invisible in her own town, became the legal guardian of a 12-year-old deaf boy who now had his very first bed that wasn't a pile of straw and a future that wasn't measured in the spaces between beatings. Caleb grew up to attend the newly founded Nebraska School for the Deaf in Omaha, his fluency in Morse code and sign making him a bridge between worlds. And every letter he wrote home to Ada began with the same palm tap pattern she had first taught him on a freezing afternoon by the stove. ICE. Ada kept those letters in a tin box beside her telegraph key for the rest of her life, and when she died at the age of 81, The town of North Platte erected a small stone marker near the depot that read simply, "She listened when the world heard nothing," a testament to the quiet operator who had looked at a boy's dancing hands and seen not affliction, but a message worth delivering. Jerry Banks had been a free man for less than 3 months when the horse went missing, and that was all the evidence the good people of Mason's Crossing, Texas, needed to tie a noose and warm up the tar. Jerry was a blacksmith by trade, a skill he'd learned in the bonds of a Louisiana sugar plantation, where his owner had recognized that the gangly, quiet young man had hands that could coax iron into obedience. And when the Emancipation Proclamation and the long bloody grind of the war finally delivered his freedom in the summer of 1865, he walked 300 miles to Texas with nothing but a hammer, a file, and the ink-stained folded parchment that proved his manumission. Mason's Crossing didn't want a freedman in its borders, but it needed a blacksmith, and so Jerry was allowed to set up his forge in a lean-to at the edge of town, his hammer ringing on the anvil from dawn until the oil lamps flickered out. His work so precise and his prices so fair that even the men who spat when he passed would quietly leave their wagon wheels and plow blades at his door after dark. The missing horse belonged to a man named Roscoe Plummer, the wealthiest rancher in the county, and the sort of bully who mistook his own bluster for righteousness. And when his prize bay gelding vanished from the livery on a moonless night, Roscoe didn't bother to check for tracks or question the stable hand who'd been drunk on duty. He simply rounded up a posse of equally drunk cronies and marched straight to Jerry's lean-to with a rope and a torch. Jerry stood in the doorway, the forge fire painting his face in flickers of orange and shadow, and tried to explain that he'd been shoeing the postmaster's mule until midnight, that he had witnesses, that he had never even seen Roscoe's horse up close. But the words dissolved against the wall of white fury like raindrops on a hot skillet. They dragged him to the hanging tree at the crossroads, the rope already slung over the branch, the tar heating in a pot someone had thought to bring. And Jerry, his voice steady despite the terror that must have been turning his bones to water, said the only thing that could save him: "I got a deed." The laughter that greeted those 4 words was a monstrous, wheezing sound, because what kind of freedman owned a deed to anything, let alone something that could absolve a horse theft? Roscoe Plummer demanded to see this supposed deed, and Jerry, with the posse's hands still gripping his arms, led them back to the lean-to and pulled up a loose floorboard to reveal a tin document box containing a single yellowed sheet of paper. It was not a deed to a horse. It was a deed to 40 acres of bottomland along the Sabine River, recorded at the county seat in 1863, signed by a Confederate officer named Captain Thaddeus J. Marlowe, who had granted the land to one Jeremy Banks, in consideration of extraordinary services rendered to the Marlowe family during the present hostilities. The paper was real, the ink was faded, but the county seal was authentic, and it proved 2 things. First, that Jerry Banks was a property owner with more legal standing than half the men in the posse, and second, that the horse theft accusation made no sense because a man who owned riverfront acreage didn't need to steal a gelding. The problem was that nobody in Mason's Crossing could read the deed beyond its face, and nobody had any intention of validating a black man's claim. So Roscoe declared the document a forgery, the horse still missing, and the hanging back on. That was when a 26-year-old lawyer from Boston, Samuel Kittredge, stepped out of the darkness at the edge of the crowd. Sam Kittredge was an anomaly in Mason's Crossing, a Harvard-educated attorney who had come west for his lung health and discovered that the dry air wasn't nearly as hostile as the locals, and he had been watching the entire spectacle from the shadows, his law books open in his rented room, his conscience burning like a slow fuse. He pushed through the circle of men, his city clothes and spectacles drawing snorts of derision, and he took the deed from Jerry's trembling hands with the same care a priest might handle a relic. This document, Sam announced in a voice that carried the crisp authority of a New England courtroom, bears the seal of the Marion County Clerk, a notary's mark, and the signature of an officer of the Confederate Army. If you hang this man without a trial, you are not only hanging a property owner, you are hanging a man whose legal standing I can prove in any Texas court. And I will personally assure that every member of this posse is charged with murder. The crowd wavered, the rope slackened, and Roscoe Plummer, who was many things but not entirely stupid, realized that killing a black man who had a wiping and authentic deed might bring more trouble than it was worth. The horse, as it turned out, had been borrowed by Roscoe's own nephew for a drunken joyride, and had wandered back to the livery by morning, its flanks sweaty and its saddle missing. And the revelation of that fact should have been the end of it, except that Sam Kittredge wasn't finished. He took the deed to the county courthouse, filed a motion to affirm the land grant, and in the process uncovered that Captain Marlowe had given Jerry the land as payment for Jerry's having forged, under threat of death, the iron shackles and bars that had kept Marlowe's own prisoners of war confined, an irony that Sam presented to the judge with barely suppressed fury. The judge, a Reconstruction appointee with a mandate to sort out exactly this kind of mess, upheld the deed, and Jeremiah Banks became the first black landowner in Mason's Crossing history, his 40 acres of Sabine bottomland eventually becoming a prosperous farm and a safe haven for other freedmen drifting through the chaos of post-war Texas. Sam Kittredge stayed in Mason's Crossing far longer than he planned, and the unlikely friendship between the blacksmith and the lawyer became a quiet cornerstone of the new social order that Reconstruction, for all its failures, managed to plant in that one dusty corner of the world. Jerry never forgot the sight of Sam's spectacles catching the torchlight on the worst night of his life, a thin beam of reason cutting through a mob's madness. And Sam never forgot the weight of that deed in his hands, a scrap of paper that held a man's entire existence, waiting for just one person who was willing to read it. 3 whispers. A woman who couldn't sit without pain, a boy whose hand screamed into the void, a freedman holding a paper that the world was ready to burn. And in each case, the noise of the frontier, the greed, the prejudice, the willful blindness, almost swallowed them whole. But the West wasn't just a land of outlaws and cattle barons. It was a land where a tired doctor, a solitary telegraph operator, and a young asthmatic lawyer could decide that silence was not an option. Their choices didn't just save lives. They rewrote the moral code of their communities. Which story will you carry with you tonight? Let us know in the comments. Your voice is part of this continuing history. If these true tales of hidden courage stirred something in you, please like this video, subscribe to Western Tales Official, and ring that bell. Because the frontier still has secrets to share, and we're not done listening. Until next time, keep your ears open and your heart ready. The quietest whisper just might change everything.